In this clip, we're going to be talking about the design of the research that students do and the logical sequence of thinking, logical steps that they need to take in order to have a clear research design following on from the client's brief.
Yep. Our standard doctrine is the client's brief is law, and in particular, beyond that law, we want to look at what the hidden client has told us about the business situation, because that's the deepest problem of all that the client brief is going to contain. So we want to produce all the deliverables and anything else that affects the business situation that has been signaled to us. That means we need to write a target executive summary which describes that stuff. The next question is, and that's the purpose of this clip, how actually do we design a piece of research which will deliver that executive summary? What do we have to do to get facts in place of X dollars, X units, the segments are, etc.? So we need to understand firstly what populations we're actually going to be talking about. And it might be useful, Mike, if I talk about a concrete example of a past project, if that's okay.
Sure.
And this was a case where a bank set up a project and said, we would like you to explore the market for using lease finance, selling lease finance basically for tractors in Spain. This is lightly disguised, just to avoid offending any actual bank. So what kind of questions we need to ask? Well, clearly this is about lease finance to farmers for tractors. So we're going to be very interested in the population of farmers. We're going to ask ourselves, farms is not the only unit of analysis. Maybe some farms don't churn the land. Maybe they don't use many tractors, cattle farms, for example. Maybe there are segments of farm enterprise we need to learn about. Do they segment by size? Maybe we want to find out whether they're big farms or small farms, and which of the segments that are going to buy most tractors, be most price sensitive, be most willing to buy the benefits of our product. So one of the first things we need to do, let's say it's in Spain, is actually define the populations we expect to be of interest, which is probably certain categories of farms in certain sizes. And then we need to be able to actually identify who belongs to that population. Can we find anybody who is a farmer? Have we got a rule for finding everybody in principle who is a farmer? And how can we firstly then assess the total population? How big is it? How does it split by Pareto? Is there an 80-20 split of the potential tractor sales? Small number of farms, very big, in the right kind of crop growing areas that are going to buy a lot of tractors and need a lot of finance, and most of the rest of the market doesn't matter? Or is there going to be some other segmentation that we have yet to learn about?
Can I just stop you there?
Sure.
And say, okay, so those are a lot of variables that say that the first task is to be clear what those variables are. But how can a group know what data is out there so that those variables are actually obtainable?
Well, that's a good question. Very often the group will find that the data don't exist. So let's plan for the worst case. Maybe there either aren't any data, or the data are not very reliable, or the data are just doubtful enough that the client insists that you cross-check. And this particular bank had a policy that says whatever the data say, we'll treat that as a hypothesis, not a fact. So the group must do some original testing to see how many farmers there are, roughly how they segment by size, and so forth. They wanted some independent cross-checks. So the task of finding out the population of farmers might involve things like looking at registers of farmers, official registers, looking at associations of farmers, looking through telephone books, looking for information in businesses that sell to farmers already. A large number of areas. Unit of analysis might be an issue. We can't study the whole of Spain, but we might say it's pretty important to understand what is happening just, upstream of the Guadalquivir estuary, and we really want to understand for that sample of geography pretty well 100% of the farmers in that 100 kilometre square, and then find out and generalize from that to how good the data are anywhere else. So running a sample-based test and designing a sample-based test could be a very important part of how you find data, and it certainly was in this particular project. Let's say you have now established what the population is. You've got a way of finding members of the population, whether it's the telephone book or any other process. You can actually get people who are in this population. Yeah. Then you need to understand what is a meaningful sample. And again, it's back to, as the sample grows, you can decide whether it's 80-20, do you need more in the 80 or do you need more in the 20? Part of the distribution, is there some special legal category that you didn't know about before, some special Spanish custom that increases or decreases the use of tractors in particular areas? All of these features. Then you can begin to say, okay, that's the population. Now we better sharpen up on what are the variables we actually need to look at. And the variables are quite interesting. There could be kind of market type variables. In principle, how many of these do you buy? How many tractors do you have at a particular moment in time? That's a kind of very generic, very generalized stuff. But if we're trying to sell tractors, or we're trying to sell the finance for the next time somebody buys a tractor, then what we actually need to know is how many deals are going to become available in the next 6 months. So what we need is not market information, we need selling information. So for every farmer we talk to, we want to know, what's your present financial contract? How long does it have to run? When's the next time you will either buy a new tractor and or get new finance? So that's a variable that the company will use in the selling process. It's not about the stock of tractors. It's about not even about the rate of purchase of tractors. It's how quickly will we get chances to sell new business in the tractor field. And that's the kind of dynamics of the selling process that you typically don't see in a lot of marketing courses in business schools. And we want to make quite sure that that category of information is represented in every MBA project where it actually functions, where it actually works. When we've got that data, then we can begin to cut deeper into exactly what the purchasing determinants are. Are people going to buy on price? Are they bundled with other products? You know, they've got a cheap deal on insurance, they've got a cheap deal with other products. The banking and the insurance are all coming from the same category, and they've got their personal finances with the bank. Maybe they can't break free. What kind of segment of customers actually are willing to buy on price for a lease, and only a lease, independently of all other products? You know, is it a big segment or a small segment? Are they going to be cheap to sell to because people buying a lot? Are they going to be expensive to sell to because they're widely scattered and they buy very small amounts over very long periods of time? You need to find out on behalf of the client what are the different shapes of selling problem the client's going to face in the different segments.
So that's a kind of conceptual way of looking at it. How does that link to design of fieldwork and what interviews you do when and that sort of thing?
I guess you've got to think about the feasible. Normally you don't have any choice about the season. You know, the project's got to happen during the spring season. Yes. Yeah, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So, you know, you don't have much choice about that. But you certainly need to be able to understand when in the day, when in the week these people are going to be available, how many are going to be available in one visit, one time. Are they available by internet, by telephone? A number of things have got to be experimented with before you can actually design a machine that's going to be able, within the required time, to get you the big enough sample size to actually quantify the size of the opportunity.
And from a kind of practical point of view, I can imagine myself as a student group sat in a project room up in the top of the business school thinking, gosh, that's an awful lot of stuff I need to find out, but it's kind of, where do I start? Now, I mean, I wonder, certainly in my experience, projects often run in an iterative rather than a linear cycle. So it is often a good idea, is it not, early on to get some very quick interviews with certain people who may be able to answer a lot of those questions for you that you've just mentioned. You mentioned how maybe you just use one region of Spain as a proxy or work out from there. So how did you know that that was the region to choose? Maybe that's just available from secondary research, but much better would be if you could actually speak to someone who knew the industry who could tell you that straight away. So for me, that one obvious bit of advice to project groups is during this phase of getting from the brief to the research design, they should be doing some research, some primary research, trying to speak to people who will help them understand and navigate their way through what are the important questions and what are the important variables and parameters and what are not, what are the ones that are just kind of theoretical.
Absolutely. An expert typically can tell you the qualitatives, what questions to ask, what not to ask roughly what the segments consist of, what kind of people do what things. What they won't know is the numbers. And it's the client that needs to know the numbers, what actual price levels for deals, what actual quantity of potential customer targets at that particular price level in any given region of Spain, any given category of enterprise. But basically, the best way to learn how to do research is to do it. So the quicker you get talking to people, the quicker you learn the language, the quicker you learn what you can't ask, what you needn't ask, and the better you get at actually designing questions to pull out the business driving facts, the deal driving facts that are actually going to work. So you don't simply say, who are the competitors? You say, when was the last time you talked to them? Do you know their prices? How often do they talk to you? Yes. You actually quantify the marketing activities of the competitors by interviewing their present customers. So
Sure.
from the very, very earliest, you're trying to learn to do research by doing it, but you're always trying to add more information. Whatever the farmer says, you want to try to go one beyond to get a piece of actual business design, marketing design information to match against the competitors. Because basically, you'd like to go to the competitors to ask what they're doing, but the competitors won't sell you anything. But if you go from the competitors to the people who buy from them, they're the ones you want to sell to, and they're the ones who will tell you what the competitors are doing, directly or indirectly. So that's what you want to start finding out.
And potentially as well, you can go the other way on the value chain, that you might find suppliers can give you good information about what they are selling to your competitors, which in other sectors maybe.
How many tractors are coming into Spain,
yes.
for example, into particular regions. And you find there's a 100% difference between the official statistics and what the importers are saying and the manufacturers are saying, then you clearly have a reality which is not accessible from the web, not accessible from published data.
Yeah. So can we just perhaps pull some of this together? I think we've gone off into practicalities, but just the logic chain, the actual sequence of thinking in getting from the requirements of the brief to the design of your research. Is there a kind of a number of steps that you could just list as a sort of A, B, C, D, E?
Well, I think very definitely it is what kind of populations are we actually needing to study? You know, who are the potential buyers we need to talk to?
So the first step is to define the populations.
Define the target populations. Second step is to find a way of identifying any one of them. How do we actually get to talk to any of them? Could be through the web, could be through mailing lists, and so on and so on and so on. We certainly want to then identify by some means, either by the sampling or by public sources or cross-checking or multiple supplier customer sources, how big those populations are, how do they segment by Pareto, how do they segment by legal limitations on them, how do they segment by buying behavior, by pricing behavior, by size of deal, all of that. So you'll be finding some unexpected, but you're looking for expected. You're looking for quantifiable, replicable things to compete with.
Yeah.
Then when you define those variables, you're starting to realize whether or not the business model you wanted to build when you started your research is still feasible. If you need to iterate, add a few more variables, you can do that halfway through the interviewing and make sure the interviewing is in future much richer than it has been hitherto.
So it's a number of steps to define the populations and the sample that you will go for, and then it is about defining, well, it's the questions that you will ask of
the
them.
Variables you want to build into your model, because you will have expected things you need to put in, like the average rate of buying tractors, and there may be some unexpected rates, like there's particular kinds of tractors or particular kinds of farming enterprise, whatever it might be.
And often what's quite important for that level as well is when actually doing the research isn't it? It's understanding the business model of the people you're speaking to and trying to speak in that language rather than coming from your client's business model and trying to sell, really, particularly if it's around sales, it's understanding how the potential customer's business model works and where their gaps and needs are through questions, really trying to understand their realm, their industry.
Absolutely, because everybody's unit of analysis starts with being cost, but it's often much more powerful to try to sell a unit of value, not of cost. For example, if you go to a farmer and say, I can save you 0.5% of the cost of a lease, if the farmer's only leasing one tractor, it's not even going to be visible. If you go to a farmer and say, I can help you to buy a tractor which costs 50% more, but will increase your entire sales income by 30% on the entire farm, you're selling a different benefit. Yeah. And you're breaking out of a constraint that, say, the local bank won't let them break out of. That's the kind of game-changing argument you want to identify in the marketplace. And if you want to know whether you're selling on cost or whether you're selling on value, and whether new deals can be generated to sell on value for maybe the biggest farms or the most productive land, and so forth. You find what you find, but you won't find it till you start looking.